I'm got late. Thank you for the sub. This is chapter 28, Black Sheep. My last days with the district attorney's office were fast approaching. It wasn't official yet, but at the time that I presented my theory to Mary Lacey and her command staff, it seemed likely that I would be returning to West Slope. Had Lacey opted to pursue the leads I was proposing, I had decided that I would stick around long enough to see it through. But it was clear that that was no longer likely. As her chief investigator, I felt that it had been my obligation to inform her of my findings and had proceeded with fingers crossed, hoping that the essence of my argument would carry the day. Perhaps some of the things I presented that day were too esoteric. January 30th happened to fall on a Monday, and late Tuesday morning, I stopped by Lacey's office on another matter. While there, she informed me that her daughter had actually run into John and Patsy Ramsey at a Boulder restaurant the previous evening. Hold on. Is that too loud? They spoke briefly and indicated they might stop by the DA's office that week for a visit. How coincidental was that? The lead investigator in their case had just come off the fence and taken a position opposite that his employer. I wondered if they really would come by the office to visit and if I'd have the opportunity to meet them. The following afternoon, I attended the case staffing at the weekly SART meeting, which as usual took several hours to complete. I returned to my office and was asked by the investigator in the neighboring space if I had been with the Ramsey family. No, I replied. I had been otherwise engaged. I checked my desk phone and saw that I had no voicemail messages or missed calls. The cell phone at my hip displayed the same information. Mary Lacey caught me at the end of the day and told me that the Ramseys had stopped by the office and that she had spent an hour or so visiting with them. She indicated that she had looked for me that afternoon to no avail. I subsequently asked my neighbor if anyone had come looking for me while I was gone that afternoon, not that she had seen. It had been said that timing is everything, and it seemed apparent that timing was against me in this instance. I had missed my opportunity to meet the parents of the little girl whose murder investigation had been entrusted into my care. Bill Nigel stopped by my office the following week. He apparently had been giving me my theory some additional thought. Bill advised me that no one had really taken a very close look at Burke and that the Ramsey's attorneys had campaigned Hunter's office to publicly clear him of any involvement in the case. All eyes were focused elsewhere, and Hunter eventually caved on the request. It made sense to me. I recalled having seen a handwritten note on attorney letterhead that had been faxed to the DA's office. It was my impression that Hunter's subsequent announcement to the media, which cleared Burke Ramsey as a potential suspect in the case, read nearly verbatim to the content of the note sent to him by the Ramsey's attorneys. I was writing reports up to the last day that I occupied my desk at the DA's office and had been unable to find the time to translate my theory into the form of a written document. The PowerPoint had been crafted over time using sticky notes scattered through numerous binders, and there wasn't always an explanation that accompanied some of these slides. I felt that a written investigative report was a necessary component of the presentation. It was a matter, I believe, of quid pro quo. Tom Bennett had permitted me to travel to Oregon in the early days of my employment with his office in order to execute an arrest warrant I obtained prior to leaving Telluride. The warrant had been issued as one in a series in a cocaine trafficking investigation I had been leading, and this subject had disappeared on the eve of our roundup. He was a key witness that needed to be turned state's evidence, and Bennett let me go on company time. I felt that I would return the favor and finish the written report after returning to Telluride. I told Tom that I thought I should be able to finish the project before the summer festival season kicked off in June. The best of intentions. April 2006 witnessed my return to the mountains of southwestern Colorado. The sabbatical I had taken in Boulder had been interesting and rewarding, but I was happy to be back. I didn't realize how much I had missed the majestic beauty and the solitude of the hills surrounding my log home. Tom Bennett had been recruited to return to Lacey's office yet again, and in this instance, it seemed that the timing of events had spared me from the humiliation of one enormous fiasco. I was unaware of it at the time, but shortly after my departure, Bennett was assigned the unfortunate task of dealing with Michael Tracy, a journalism professor and movie maker who had become focused on the Ramsey investigation. He wanted us to help him track down a pedophile who was claiming by email to have been the person responsible for JonBenét's abduction and murder. April and May were occupied with the move to a new headquarters building for my department, and Bennett was fully engaged in Tracy's mess. Unbeknownst to me, he was working 7 days a week on nothing but that case. June brought the death of Patsy from the second bout with ovarian cancer, and a media frenzy once again surrounded the family. I should not have been surprised to see Mary Lacey attending the funeral services. The summer festival season demanded my attention, and my thoughts of the Ramsey case fell further from my mind. I had begun to debate whether it was really necessary to pursue the course I had suggested to Lacey given all the pain and suffering the family had endured that year. Then all hell broke loose. It was soon broadcast all over media in August of that summer that there had been an arrest in the Ramsey case. John Mark Carr had been identified as the person responsible for corresponding with Tracy via email, and he was to be brought back to Colorado from Thailand for further investigation. There were not a lot of details released in the first hours of Carr being taken into custody, and I thought to myself, damn, they finally caught the son of a bitch. I shot a quick email to Bennett congratulating him on their arrest. His response was less than enthusiastic. Bennett didn't think this was the guy. Perhaps half a dozen reporters called my office in search of details. I was asking questions too, because there was not a lot of information being reported about the things Carr had disclosed to Tracy in his emails. I wondered what it was that had been said that led authorities to seek his arrest. Within a few days, the details of his writings began to publicly emerge. I told a friend in the media that John Mark Carr was no doubt a pedophile, but he wasn't responsible for the murder of JonBenet. His written explanation of the events was pure fantasy and didn't match the forensics of the case. For immediate release, August 16, 2006. Statement of John Ramsey on today's arrest in connection with the murder of his daughter, JonBenet Ramsey. I want to have only limited comment on today's arrest because I feel it is extremely important to not only let the justice system operate to its conclusion in an orderly manner, but also to avoid feeding the type of media speculation that my wife and I were subjugated to for so many years, said John Ramsey. I do not want to say, however, that the investigation of the individual arrest today in connection with JonBenet's death was discussed with Patsy and me by the Boulder District Attorney's Office prior to Patsy's death in June. So Patsy was aware that the authorities were close to making an arrest in the case, and had she lived to see the day, would no doubt have been as pleased as I am with today's development almost 10 years after our daughter's murder. Words cannot adequately express my gratitude for the efforts of the Boulder District Attorney, May Lacey, and the members of her investigative team. Patsy Ramsey lost a 13-year battle with ovarian cancer and passed away on June 24th. The Ramseys and I have totally been amazed and impressed with the professionalism of law enforcement under the direction of Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey. This obviously an incredibly complex task, but one that has been carried out in almost textbook fashion, with the investigation of this individual going on for several months without any leads on the case, said Elle Wood, attorney for the Ramsey family and partner at Powell Goldenstein in Atlanta. I want to express my heartfelt thanks to the many people who have stood by the Ramseys, believing in them and their innocence these long and difficult years. John Ramsey will not be providing interviews at this time. Requesting for future interviews should be directed to Lynn Wood, attorney for the Ramseys family. Mr. Lynn Wood, Powell Goldstein LLP, 1 Atlantic Center, 4th floor, 1201 West Peachtree Street, Northwest Atlanta, Georgia. Press release issued by John Ramsey and attorney Lynn Wood following the Boulder District Attorney's Office arrest of John Michael Carr in Thailand, August 2006. Chapter 29, Karmic Reality. But look. Cheesy. I watched with interest the continuing news coverage of Carr's extradition proceedings. It was reminiscent of the feeding frenzy from the early days of the investigation, and I couldn't help but read Tom Bennett's displeasure of having to stand in the wings behind his boss as they spoke about the circumstances leading to the arrest of the man thought responsible for JonBenét's murder. We'd had no further correspondence about the case since the brief email exchange, but Bennett's expression and demeanor seemed to say it all. This was not a time of celebration, and he held no illusion that this was the intruder we'd all been chasing for years. The photographs and videotape of Carr sipping champagne on his flight to the U.S. was too much to bear. Oh, this was not going to end well, I thought. It didn't take long for the media to pull up their archive files on the case and locate Dorothy Allison's composite sketch of her vision of the murder. Side by side, photographic comparisons were displayed for the public that revealed Carr's uncanny resemblance to Allison's psychic rendering of the perpetrator. There were more than a few who had seemed to consider the similarities of Carr's features to that of the man portrayed in the psychic sketch as proof that the DA's office had finally found their man. In many corners, and in spite of the fact the DNA test had not yet been completed, people were celebrating the fact that JonBenét's killer had finally been caught. Some went so far as to renew their criticism of the Boulder Police Department's previous handlings of the investigation, apparently thinking that Carr's DNA would seal the case against him. In response to some of these comments, the members of the Boulder Police Department's legal dream team prepared a statement that was released on August 31st, 2006. It reads as follows: Police response to allegations. Recent events in the nearly 10-year-old homicide of JonBené Ramsey have rekindled the firestorm of accusations about how the Boulder Police Department handled the investigation into her death. The department had remained silent in recent years as the effort to correct inaccuracies seemed futile. In the fall of 1997, 3 prominent Denver area attorneys, Dan Hoffman, Robert Miller, and Richard Baer, assisted the Boulder Police Department with the investigation after reading the comments made by Tripp DeMuth in today's Rocky Mountain News. All 3 felt compelled to contact the police department to provide support. They have authorized the Boulder Police Department to release this statement on their behalf. We assisted the Boulder Police Department in their investigation of the murder of JonBené Ramsey. Throughout our involvement and to this day, We have never spoken to the media about this case because we feel that comments made by anyone involved in the investigation could only compromise the ability to prosecute the perpetrator or perpetrators of this horrible crime. However, we are compelled to respond to the irresponsible statements of one of the deputy district attorneys who worked on the case, Trip DeMuth. Some 10 years later, after the fact, DeMuth claims that he was somehow prevented by the Boulder Police Department from pursuing leads in the investigation. Based on our knowledge of this matter, DeMuth's claim is ridiculous. Mr. DeMuth's assertion that the Boulder Police Department refused to pursue a variety of theories is also ludicrous. In our opinion, the Boulder Police Department, as well as Michael Caine, an experienced prosecutor, conducted an exhaustive and wide-ranging investigation on this matter. If Mr. DeMuth truly cares about seeing justice done, he should act responsibly and refrain from making inaccurate statements that could further jeopardize the investigation. The Boulder Police Department over the years investigated more than 160 potential suspects in the case. A few people have accused the department of focusing too narrowly in its investigation of this homicide when that was not the case, said Chief Mark Beckner. People have spoken out that people who have spoken out that way have relied on the department's inability to discuss case specifics, but I cannot allow the misinterpretations to go unanswered any further. Daniel Hoffman has practiced law in Colorado since 1958, and he was the dean of the University of Denver College of Law from 1978 to 1984. He is now in private practice at a firm in Denver. Robert Miller was the U.S. Attorney for Colorado from 1981 to 1988. Before that, he was the Weld County District Attorney for 10 years. He is now in private practice in Denver. Richard Baer was a state prosecutor in New York before joining a law firm in Denver. He is now the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for a large corporation in Denver. Julie Brooks, PIO, City of Boulder. It was painful to watch the follow-up press conference declaring John Mark Carr innocent of this crime. Though Lacey had initially cautioned the public not to rush to judgment about Carr's arrest in the matter, the time had finally come to announce that his DNA did not match the genetic materials found in John Bonet's underwear. Mary Lacey reported that despite their best efforts, they had not found their man. I was embarrassed for the Boulder County District Attorney's Office and for the Boulder Police Department. Chief Beckner apparently had only been told about this lead in the hours before Carr's arrest, and no investigator from his agency had participated in the investigation that brought Carr back to the U.S. soils. Nevertheless, Beckner had issued a press release the day after Carr's arrest, stating that the department was pleased with the recent development in the case, and that his investigators were hopeful that the arrest of John Mark Carr would lead to closure in the case. Beckner went to state that he knew there were still many questions that needed to be answered in the case, but that his department stood ready to assist the DA's office in tracking down those answers. It was reported that approximately $35,100 had been expended in the pursuit of this lead. I later learned that Tom Bennett had worked approximately 3 months straight putting things together for Lacey. He took not a solitary day off in the entire time frame. He was ever still the dependable workhorse. I wondered if the result would have been different if Lacey's office had been willing to put forth the effort in pursuing the direction I suggested to her earlier that year. In my humble opinion, there was more substance presence in the details I had shared with her than in the delusionary musings of this particular child molester. I decided that I really needed to finish my written analysis of the theory. I had developed earlier in the year and set about doing so in earnest. I delivered a single binder to Tom Bennett on October 8, 2006 that contained a detailed synopsis of my findings, accompanied by the supporting materials that made up the PowerPoint presentation. As was practice when writing investigative reports for the DA's office, I presented copies of my work product to the law enforcement agency holding primary jurisdiction for the crime. I hand delivered a copy of the binder to Bart Beckner. While my interest in the Ramsey case may have waned during the summer, it became re-energized after the completion of my written synopsis. Among other things, I was genuinely convinced that there was merit to the exploration of Burke's psychiatric records. I had received no word from Bennett that my materials had been reviewed or that my efforts in completing this task for Lacey's office were even appreciated. Based on my view of her efforts in the car debacle, I felt that it was unlikely that anyone had cracked the cover on my work. She seemed unwilling to consider any lead that would explore family involvement. I decided to query her office with the request to have the materials/theory presented to the prosecutors who had been most familiar with the details of the case and who had participated in the 1998 grand jury investigation. I was politely requesting an objective review by these distinguished attorneys. The following is a redacted version of the correspondence I sent to the DA's office in the fall of 2006. October 31st, 2006. Honorable Mary Lacey, District Attorney, 20th Judicial District Attorney's Office, 1777 6th Street, P.O. Box 471, Boulder, Colorado, 80306. Dear Mary, as you are aware, I recently provided the Chief Investigator Tom Bennett with the final version of a written outline of my analysis of the investigation and circumstances surrounding the death of JonBenet Ramsey. This outline was completed for the purposes of accompanying the PowerPoint presentation of the case that I provided to you in January of this year. The underlying premise of this theory suggests that no intruder participated in the premature death of JonBenet Ramsey. I would advise you that I did not arrive at this decision casually, nor was it due to preconceived notions held prior to my involvement in the investigation of the case. It was my responsibility to acquaint myself with the details of the investigation when I assured the lead investigative role to your office in July of 2005, and I set about reviewing what I considered to be the core documents of the investigation. I felt I needed to get up to speed with the facts of the case so that I could properly evaluate new leads that were continuously streaming into our office. I have to admit that the circumstances surrounding the death of JonBenet were very perplexing, and it presented as a very complicated and unusual case. Nevertheless, I was intent on bringing an objective viewpoint to the inquiry, and I continued my research into the circumstances of this crime. In search of motive, opportunity, and a better understanding of the events, I pursued many questions that led to dead ends. I took another look at suspects who had previously been cleared, and I continued to examine the statements and behaviors of the Ramsey family. It was only after approximately 5 months of intensive examination of these documents did I come to believe that the family was somehow involved in the death of JonBenet. I did not quite know how or why, but at that juncture, I no longer felt it was likely that an intruder had participated in this crime. While continuing to evaluate new leads coming into our office, I began to narrow the focus of my review on the family. Over the course of the following months, I began to discover things that tended to support my belief, and as I evaluated behavioral clues, statements, and physical evidence, a plausible theory of family involvement and cover-up began to take form. Although I left your office in the late spring of this year, the details of this investigation have ever been in the forefront of my mind, and written outline presented to Tom Bennett several weeks ago is a culmination of the deliberative process that has been ongoing since the day I first reviewed the Ramsey homicide report. As a distant observer to the events surrounding the arrest of John Mark Carr, I initially was cautiously optimistic that he might prove to be the intruder who was responsible for the murder of John Bonet. By all accounts, he was presenting as a dangerous pedophile. Until the case is solved, all things should be considered possible. Unfortunately, it soon became apparent to me, based upon statements attributed to him by the media, that Mr. Carr did not know what he was talking about. When correspondence with Mr. Lacey was finally revealed, it was clear that his stated version of events were inconsistent with the autopsy findings and physical evidence discovered during the processing of the crime scene. From the perspective of a 30-year-old veteran of law enforcement, I understand that you wanted to be absolutely certain that Mr. Carr was not the perpetrator of this offense and felt it necessary to eliminate him by comparing his DNA to the forensic sample found in the case. Nevertheless, I would suggest that the DNA in this case is only one artifact of evidence, and its evidentiary value must be considered in light of all the other pieces of physical, testimonial, and behavioral evidence. Part 3, a family affair. Let's go. Federal judge, no evidence that Ramsey's killed John Bonet. U.S. District Attorney Judge Julie E. Carnes, a former federal prosecutor, ruled that there is abundant evidence to support assertions by John Bonet's parents, John B. and Patricia P. Patsy Ramsey, that an intruder entered their home at some point during the night of December 25, 1996, and killed their daughter. Carnes ordered stem from a 2000 case filed in U.S. District Court, Atlanta, by Robert Christian Wolf, a Boulder, Colorado journalist who had written for the Colorado Daily and the Boulder County Business Report. Wolf, who had been questioned by Boulder police as a potential suspect in John Bonet's murder, sued the Ramseys. He claimed that Patsy Ramsey and her husband, as a way of directing police suspicion away from Patsy, had hired private detectives to investigate Wolf and others in hopes of encouraging the authorities to arrest the plaintiff for the murder of her daughter. On March 31st, Carnes dismissed the case against the Ramseys on a motion for summary judgment. Nothing that if Wolf could not prove by clear of convincing evidence that his theory that the Ramseys killed their daughter was true. He cannot demonstrate that their statement concerning his status as a suspect was made with the requisite malice. It is the first time that a judge has reviewed all the evidence pertaining to John Bonet's murder and released a public analysis of the case, said the Ramseys' attorney, L. Linwood Jr. I just find it from A to Z a total unequivocal victory for John and Patsy Ramsey, Wood said. The court has done what I've urged the public to do from day one. Look at the evidence. If you look at the evidence, you will reach the same conclusion Judge Carnes reached. This is a family that has been horribly and wrongly accused of the murder of their child. Wood said that since Boulder County District Attorney Mary W. Keenan took office, she has rejuvenated the investigation into John Bonet's murder, characterizing Keenan's investigation as very active. Wood said investigators are doing things in that case that have never been done before, including testing foreign male DNA that was found in JonBenet's underwear. R. Robin McDonald, Fulton County Daily Report, April 7, 2003. Chapter 30. New questions emerge. As noted in other chapters, I had been researching the official family statements made over the course of the investigation, and those included those that had been provided by Burke. Some things said by him had set off faint alarm bells, and I was continuing to look for things that could help clarify questions I had heard about his behavior. Having explored the window well and the stun gun, thought to be specific elements that pointed to the existence of an intruder, I turned my attention to the DNA evidence found in the underwear worn by JonBenet at the time of her death. I met with the man who had worked so diligently to enhance the DNA sample identified as distill stain 007-2. Denver Police Department Crime Lab Supervisor Greg LeBerge met me for lunch in early December 2005 and advised me that forensic DNA sample collected from the underwear was microscopic, totally invisible to the naked eye. So small was it in quantity, consisting of only approximately 1/2 nanogram of genetic material, equivalent to about 1/150th of a cell, that it took him quite a bit of work to identify the 10th marker that eventually permitted its entry into the CODIS database. DNA samples generally consist of 13 core loci markers, so it is important to note that the distill stain 007-2 is not a full sample of DNA, and that FBI requires at least 10 markers to be identified before an unknown sample can be entered into the National CODIS database. LeBerge indicated that the sample had flashed the color of blue during the CBI's initial testing of the sample, suggesting that amylase was present. Amylase is an enzyme that can be found in saliva, and it had been theorized by other investigators in the case that someone involved in the production phase of the clothing article could have been the source of this unknown DNA samples. It was thought that this could have been deposited there by coughing, sneezing, or spitting, and through a simple transfer of saliva on the hands of a garment handler. LeBerge confirmed that no traces of semen had been present in the underwear or clothing articles worn by JonBenet up until the discovery of her body. LeBerge advised, confirming that Tom Bennett had previously shared with me, that some random DNA tests had been conducted in off-the-shelf children's underwear to determine if trace biological DNA samples could be obtained from brand new clothing that had been shipped from the manufacturer. I indicated that the DNA samples had been located on the articles of new clothing, but that they had been approximately 1/10 the strength of the unknown sample found in JonBenet's underwear. The male sample identified in distill stain 007-2 was weak and degrading to begin with. The weaker samples of the same genetic material were found in the waistband and the leg bands of the underwear. It was observed that these were areas of the clothing that would have been handled more strenuously during the production phase of the clothing article. LeBerge indicated that it was his opinion that the male sample of DNA could have been deposited there by a perpetrator, or that there could have been some other explanation for its presence, totally unrelated to the crime. I would learn that many other scientists held the same opinion. We talked about other aspects of the case, and he pointed out that he was only a scientist and not familiar with the details of the investigative side of the case. It was my understanding that the Bloomies brand of underwear worn by JonBenet at the time of the discovery of her body was manufactured and produced in Taiwan. making it entirely possible that the article of clothing was produced in a garment sweatshop. Sweatshops have historically employed child labor, and as there is currently no scientific method available to allow us to determine the age of a contributor, I had thought it feasible that the unknown forensic sample of male DNA found in JonBenét's underwear could have belonged to a Taiwanese boy. Furthermore, there is no specific method to determine when a biological specimen was placed at the scene of a crime. Under these circumstances, I believed, as did many of the other investigators working with the case, that there had been a plausible explanation for the DNA found in the underwear and that its presence may have had nothing whatsoever to do with the death of JonBenet. The presence of this DNA in question that remains to be resolved, but it continues to be my opinion that this single piece of DNA evidence has to be considered in the light of all the other physical, behavioral, and statement evidence that has been collected over the course of the investigation. Realizing that there had been a rational explanation for the unidentified male DNA being found in JonBenét's underwear did not deter me from continuing to assess new leads that were continuing to stream into the office. Around this time period, I took a call from an FBI agent in the Midwest who wanted to pass along information she had received from an individual who had a track record of cooperating in other criminal investigations. The CI told her that a subject known to them had once worked and lived in the Boulder area and that they had returned to their Midwest farm home very shortly after JonBenét's death. The CI told the agent that the subject had become very reclusive and was acting out of character. Apparently, the decision to return home was very spontaneous. Ugh. I know words. I know the best words. Believe me. Apparently, the decision to return home was very spontaneous, and although a long shot, the CI thought that it bore mentioning to authorities. I obtained the name and date of birth for the suspect and ran a criminal history to check for an arrest record. I don't recall that there had been any history of arrest for this subject, but I did locate a traffic citation when querying his driving history in Colorado. The ticket had been issued in a mountain resort county approximately 7 months after JonBenét's murder. The timing of this citation placed the subject in Colorado for considerably longer than what the CI was indicating as a return date to the Midwest. I proceeded to obtain a photographed copy of the traffic ticket to check out the handwriting of the defendant. I recognized that the block handwriting of the ransom note would likely be different than when compared to the actual signature of an individual, but observed that neither bore any resemblance to the other. Some other minor details were explored with this lead, and I didn't believe that they pointed to the need for a trip to the Midwest. It joined the file of many that didn't appear to hold any true promise. In the fall of 2005, I had decided to take another look at the theory proposed by retired FBI agent John Douglas. He had the opportunity to interview John and Patsy Ramsey in early January 1996, and at the time when they were still holding Boulder Police Department detectives at bay. And I wondered what type of insight he may have gained with his face-to-face encounter with the parents. He had devoted an entire chapter of his participation in the JonBenet investigation in this book, The Cases That Haunt Us. Ooh. I haven't read that book yet. And I spent some of the time reviewing his analysis of the details of the case. Sorry, I'm distracted. I want to read the new book. Douglas noted that he had not been hired by the Ramseys to provide a profile of a possible offender although based upon his initial review of the circumstances during his interview with the parents, believed that the perpetrator was someone who was familiar with John and who had harbored ill feelings toward him. It was thought that the killer had been in the Ramsey home sometime prior to the murder. A personal cause homicide was believed to have been the motive for the murder, and Douglas pointed to the elements of revenge and retaliation that had been voiced in the ransom note as the basis for this opinion. Following his brief interview with John and Patsy, he had told their attorneys that he didn't believe the parents had murdered their daughter. Ramsey attorneys would subsequently arrange to have Douglas meet with the Boulder Police Department investigators to share his thoughts about the case. Though they had already been consulting with the FBI from the onset of the investigation, lead detectives in the case listened politely to his early analysis of the crime. This took place the day after he had interviewed the parents. When all was said and done, the investigators thanked the former FBI profiler for his time and continued to process of chasing leads in their case. Despite the generosity exhibited by Ramsey attorneys to share the opinion of their expert witnesses, the Boulder Police Department elected to continue their dialogue with the men and women of the FBI's specialized unit that were fully conversant with the active and emerging details of the investigation. As further outlined in his book, Douglas advised that it was his belief that the motive for this crime was personal and directed specifically at John Ramsey. He didn't believe that this was the work of a serial killer and thought that the person responsible was an inexperienced mission-oriented offender. For that reason, he didn't anticipate that there would be a repeat of this specific signature crime that would capture the attention of authorities. The ransom demand of $118,000 matched a year-end bonus that John Ramsey had received, and Douglas thought that the perpetrator had somehow gained access to this information and used it in the kidnapping note. The unknown subject was thought to be a white male in his 30s or 40s with some type of business background, although Douglas indicated that he would later revise the age of the perpetrator downward. His final profile suggested that the killer was relatively young and that he carried a personal grudge against JonBenét's father. The act of murdering this little girl had served to rob John Ramsey of the most valuable thing to him in the world. Business meetings. His daughter, supposedly. I'm so tired. Despite the presence of this ransom demand, Douglas did not believe that this was a crime of criminal enterprise which would have rallied upon the motive of financial gain. There was some type of personal motive involved in the planning and commissioning of this crime, and apparently the demand for money was mentioned only as a ruse. Like the FBI agents who had already worked with the Boulder Police Department detectives, Douglas thought that the crime scene and crime exhibited signs of both an organized and unorganized offender. This suggested to him that the individual responsible for this crime was criminally unsophisticated. In his book, Douglas spent some time analyzing and opposing theories as proposed by detectives Thomas and Smith, and proposed a few rhetorical questions of his own about how some of the elements involved in the crime He provided, based on his experience, some answers to the questions that had been posed. I noted that Douglas had indicated that he had not been provided full access to an entire range of police investigative reports and witness statements, and that his former colleagues at the FBI, BAU, KASKU units were considering as they consulted with the Boulder Police Department detectives. He was forced to rely only upon the information that had been provided to him by the parents of the murdered child in order to establish his offender profile. I considered this significant when it came time to evaluate his opinion on the matter. As Douglas went through his analysis of the case, he cited Sherlock Holmes's investigative dictum that states, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." I would eventually think it apropos, apropos, apropos. I've never seen this word in my life. Oh, I look like a fool. Oh my God. Oh. It just keeps getting worse. What is happening? My life is a mess. I would eventually think it, I'm blushing, apropos. That's what I'm going with. Okay. That he would offer this investigative theorem as a basis for his analysis of JonBenét's homicide investigation. It is something that would also be argued at the conclusion of my investigative journey into this murder of this little girl. Before I had ever become involved in the investigation of this murder, I had contemplated Smith's theory regarding the use of a stun gun by an intruder. It was his opinion that the stun gun had been used as a means of controlling JonBenet. Douglas had covered the use of the stun gun when reviewing Smith's theory, and once again I gave this aspect of the crime some thought. It is important to note that a stun gun, also known as an electronic control device, an ECD, in today's nomenclature, does not render a person unconscious. It delivers approximately 600,000 volts of electricity to its victim and disrupts the body's neurotransmitters, which essentially physically incapacitates a person while the electronic charge is being delivered. Muscular control is virtually non-existent during the activation of the device, and a person is incapable of fighting back or resisting during the event. Depending upon the device used, the duration of a normal electrical charge is 5 seconds long, and neuromuscular incapacitation ceases when the ECD has finished doing its job. It is important to note, however, that a person can fight back after the delivery of an electronic charge, and that those under the influence of narcotics or alcohol frequently require more than one electronic dose before they are ready to submit to arrest or control. There are two methods used to deliver an electronic charge to an individual depending on the type of device used. One involves the discharge of two barbed probes that are shot from the head of an ECD. The barbed probes are capable of being shot of a distance of up to 35 feet and remain connected to the device by thin wires. The probes must properly embed themselves on the individual being targeted, and if sufficiently anchored, the circuit is completed with an electric charge that is then delivered by the ECD. As noted above, the initial dose usually lasts about 5 seconds, but this can be cut short by the operator, or additional follow-up doses may be delivered. A second method involves direct contact with the head of an ECD and the subject being targeted. The twin electric contact leads on the head of the ECD are placed flush on the body, and the operator activates the device to deliver the electronic charge. This type of contact is referred to as a drive stun in taser nomenclature. It is this type of device that Smith believed was responsible for the marks of JonBenét's body. The problem I had with Smith's theory is that the use of this device would not have knocked JonBenet out, nor do I think that it would have made her more compliant with her kidnapper. The delivery of this electronic charge is extremely painful, and most people scream uncontrollably when they have been on the receiving end of this less lethal law enforcement tool. From the law enforcement point of view, an ECD is used to temporarily incapacitate and induce pain compliance when confronting a violent, out-of-control subject or in situations where lethal force might otherwise be legally employed. The idea being, by way of example, is that an incapacitating dose from an ECD may temporarily disable a knife-wielding suspect long after, so that we may disarm him without having to resort to shooting him with a firearm. The distance can be maintained by an officer with an armed subject under these circumstances. Under these circumstances is what makes this tool so effective. I don't want to make this sound overly simplistic. There are many circumstances that come into play when an officer has to make a split-second decision regarding the use of a deadly force. I am merely attempting to provide some background on the use of a device that was developed to help law enforcement personnel better do their job. It was not clear to me when Smith thought that the stun gun had actually been used during the kidnapping, but it is my belief that JonBenet would have screamed bloody murder if it had ever been used on her. Moreover, it is his opinion that the stun gun had been used twice during her abduction, once on her face and once on her back. Sound asleep or otherwise, I don't believe she would have ever been able to have controlled herself vocally if confronted with the excruciating pain of this device. The need for the use of a stun gun in the torture and murder of Gerald Boggs may have very well played some significance in that crime. On the other hand, to use this device on a small 6-year-old girl within earshot of the family seemed extremely improbable from my point of view. It didn't quite make sense to me that an adult male, presumably the person responsible for this kidnapping, would require this type of device to control a 45-pound 6-year-old girl. The use of duct tape or a hand over JonBenet's mouth would have easily sufficed. There was one additional lead that had come into our office in the closing weeks of my tenure that I intended to try to track down. Someone had suggested that a couple of construction workers had also been acting strange around the time of JonBenet's murder and were purportedly involved in the remodel of a garage somewhere in her neighborhood. It was a very vague lead, and no names were provided for the construction workers and for people whose names were being remodeled. Acting strange and being somewhere nearby were frequently key words that prompted people to write and call into the office, but I was trying to remain open to the possibility that one tip might eventually pay dividends. I had considered the FBI's earlier opinion more than one individual being involved in this crime. Certainly, the possibility existed that a remodel of a garage in the area of the Ramsey home might point to 2 construction workers who had become infatuated with the 6-year-old girl living nearby. I had thought that I might canvass the neighborhood to see if any such projects were actually being taken place at the time of the murder, but time was not on my side. I left the DA's office before I was able to find the time to knock on any doors. It probably would not have mattered in any regard. By the time I parted company with the DA's office, I was convinced that there was no significant possibility that an intruder had been involved in the death of JonBenet. Subsequent events would only serve to solidify that opinion. We could find the killer tomorrow. He could be arrested, convicted, and, jailed. There'd still be 20% of the population that would think we had something to do with it. John Ramsey, during an interview aired on 48 Hours, investigates searching for a killer, October 4th, 2002. I don't give a flying flip how scientific it is. Go back to the damn drawing board. I didn't do it. John Ramsey didn't do it. And we don't have a blood clue of anybody who did do it. Quit screwing around and ask me about things that are ridiculous, and let's find the person who did this. Patsy Ramsey, in response to an investigator who indicated that trace evidence appeared to link her to the death of her daughter, Boulder District Attorney's interviews, June 1998. We're on page 314. Thank you for being here. On another note, 8 days ago, the President of the United States, cut 400 FAA senior offices. He fired the TSA head officer. He also fired 3,000 air traffic controllers. This morning there was an air collision between a commercial airline and a helicopter. Some of you don't know me very well. You're new here. I worked in rotorcraft aeromechanics for 4 years for NASA. I then worked another year in private contracts. Literally 1 year ago, I applied through the Port of Portland for an internship with these credentials. All of those credentials. I also have a 4-year degree in environment sciences, specifically meteorology. Mind you, I was very qualified in my personal opinion. I was qualified for the job, the role of intern. I spent 4 months applying for one job as an intern and did not make the cut. So when the president goes out of his way to displace me and all of my hard work, this is where I'm at in life, man. I just lost an hourly job at a hotel. You know, this is not... 64 people's families are permanently damaged, and I literally just suffered from a loss that happened overnight, and to know that 64 other people are now suffering, it really bothers me, you know? Anyways, I think that we should really hunker down and look for the facts in all of these things, because what we are experiencing is not normal. This is not... I'm really tired, you know? Okay. Thank you for being here.